Okay, let's take a look at this next group of writers here. The first one we want to look at is Charles Chesnutt, African-American writer, son of interracial parents. Now, very involved in education also, became the principal of the State Colored Normal School, which later became Fayetteville State University. Here's a picture of him. Note the interracial heritage. Talk about that in a minute. Novels and short stories examine post-Civil War South's social and racial relations. So the very important theme right now in a lot of the writing that we're going to be seeing. As a lawyer, he was active in the NAACP, writing articles on education and challenging racial inequality in the law. So, idea of direct intervention here about making change where change can happen. So he wrote about people dealing with complex issues of race, passing, and identity. So this idea of passing is something that you could see, and we're going to see in a couple novels here, where people can pass as white, which some people do, other people don't. And we can see here that he could pass, but he declared himself African American. Some of his works include Conjure Woman, The House Behind the Cedars. He's got some other things, some of the names you should remember there. In one of his stories, The Passing of Grandison, this is a story about a Southerner that goes, a slave that's taken up north, and the story is that the one woman says, "I will marry you if you take," she kind of romanticizes this idea of take one of the, slaves up north and have him escape. But then Grandison goes up north, but he doesn't escape at all. He returns on his own accord to the south. I mean, he's there after some part of the plot there. So he returns to the south and is thus rewarded a slave position in his master's house. So when he returns south, everyone's like, "Oh wow, you came back!" But they're surprised. He takes off with his extended family, not up north when he had the chance, but down south when they were least expecting it. And I think the final scene, if I remember correctly, they see him, across the water, making his way. Let's take a look here at Charlotte Perkins Gilman. So she was a social activist and feminist for unorthodox lifestyle. And very important to look at some of these women here in the way that they live their lives. And this is reflected in their writing. So she separated, divorced, and eventually remarried, which was uncommon at the times. Not like today where, you'll see some of the famous actors have, 7 or 8, spouses. But, back then it was pretty unorthodox. Here's a picture of her. Another photograph taken there. So she wrote short stories, poems, nonfiction in general. And you could see here one of her great stories that I really love is The Yellow Wallpaper. I want to talk about this for a sec. She was a supporter of euthanasia, that's assisted suicide is an example. She took her own life when she was diagnosed with breast cancer. So this whole connection with doctors and science and psychology and state of being is connected in this particular short story. So in The Yellow Wallpaper, it's a short story about a woman who's committed to bed rest by her doctor after giving birth. She didn't, postpartum depression here. And the idea of, women you get depressed after you have a baby, so you need to go rest. But she didn't want to be confined, no? So this story is about what actually happened to her. So in this story here, she's staring at the wallpaper for unending hours. She imagines that a woman is trapped in it, and she rips the wallpaper from the wall trying to free her, only to discover that it is herself who is trapped. So this is an interesting story because it was rediscovered years later by the feminist press, where it became a bestseller. And it's important because it brings to light a lot of the conditions women suffered at the time by other people that thought that they knew what was best for women. And in her particular case, it shows here how women's lack of self-determination can be detrimental to their mental health, how women need to control their own situation and make their own decisions. So it's semi-autobiographical in that sense because it reflects the mistreatment by her first husband and by a doctor that actually prescribed her this particular rest also. Hamlin Garland, our next writer, was a Pulitzer Prize winning American novelist. We're going to be seeing now a lot of people winning a Pulitzer Prize, 2 Pulitzer Prizes, maybe even 3 or 4, plus the Nobel Prize, plus the American Book Award. A lot of these prizes are coming about, and recognition of some of our great authors. So he was also a poet and a writer of short stories and essays. He's best known for his regionalist fiction about Midwestern farmers. And you could see here how we have another regionalist writer. We've seen a lot of different writers that are regionalists in the area, and it's geographically interesting to place people that represent a lot of the different parts of the United States. So he was interested in Henry George's single tax movement, which influenced a lot of his novels. So this is, once again, a lot of involved writing there about the social situation, about change. And we've seen this with a lot of the writers, like with African American writers and with a lot of the women writers. And here's a fellow also that's involved in something that's political. So the idea of social and political change also was very important in that regard. So he published his autobiography, A Son of the Middle Border, in 1917, and wrote a sequel to that. And he won the Pulitzer Prize for biography for this in 1922. The next writer we're going to look at here is Edith Wharton. She was a novelist, poet, and short story writer, first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize, and she was nominated a number of times for the Nobel Prize in Literature. And here we have her here commemorated on a stamp. Like I mentioned, a lot of the great writers have a stamp dedicated to them. Realist and naturalist perspective in her work. She wrote from her experiences with the American middle and upper class, which gave a psychological understanding of her characters. And this is, once again, important because of the psychological perspective of observation. What do you see, and what are they thinking about, and how do they interact? Her more read works are The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence, for which she won the Pulitzer Prize. And she has a naturalist novel also here, Ethan Frome. So this is an interesting quote that she wrote here. She divorced her husband, and she said in a letter to a friend, "I wonder, among all the tangles of this mortal coil, which one contains tighter knots to undo and consequently suggests more tugging and pain and diversified elements of misery than the marriage tie." So this is an important quote that she has said here in a letter to a friend, but it points out the dilemma of marriage that can be seen in many of her works. And once again, an important writer to talk about the institution of marriage, the institution of relationships in a social context. W.B. Du Bois here, very important African American writer. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard, and then he taught at other universities. Once again, as we saw with Booker T. Washington, the importance of African Americans in education now, equal opportunities, coming across here, once again involved in the NAACP. Here we have a picture of him on another stamp. So he advocated political and social intervention for change, which was opposite of Booker T. Washington. He was more directly involved in that change itself. And he said, no, we're not going to go with the flow and work and make change come about by hard work. We need to get involved and have people become activists for that change. The Souls of Black Folk, written here in 1903, is a collection of essays and stories that shows how African Americans should be agents of change in politics and education and intellectual thought, which he obviously was definitely connected to himself. Advocated for suffrage and political representation, voting rights. Important idea here, the idea of double consciousness of African Americans. How they see themselves, how others see them, and not how they see themselves. And it sounds kind of complicated, but it's basically looking at yourself through another person's eyes rather than looking through your own. This idea of like double consciousness, no? We have to, get rid of that platform and only have this idea of how we see ourselves, not how other people see us, and adapt to that. So once again, involved in the NAACP, in their journal here, The Crisis, it published many influential pieces as a professor, as a writer. Black Reconstruction in America was written to exculpate African Americans from their belief that they're responsible for failures of the Reconstruction era. Just a quick note on that there, but it's very interesting to now look at the historical ideas, re-lexicalizing, redefining history. This is not what happened. We need to go back and look at that with a new perspective. So this is kind of a rewriting of that point there. So he also wrote autobiographies, all of which have essays on history, sociology, and politics. Very involved man, very intellectual, very diverse in his writing and in his advocating for change for African Americans. So these are some of the writers of this next segment, and let's move on now to take a look at the next group.